before Rome, before Athens, before the pyramids rose above the sands of Egypt, there was a land of mud and reeds where everything began. Between two slow brown rivers, on a flat plain that shimmered with heat by day and glittered with stars by night, human beings built the first cities the world had ever seen. They raised the first temples, wrote the first words, sang the first recorded songs, passed the first written laws, and brewed, it must be said, the first beer. The Greeks would later call this land Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, and almost everything we take for granted. The wheel turning beneath a cart, the 60 minutes in an hour, the written contract, the school, the map, the love song can trace some part of its ancestry back to this quiet, dusty plain. And yet, for more than 2,000 years, the whole of it lay forgotten beneath the earth. Its cities became shapeless mounds. Its writing became a mystery no one alive could read. Its very names, Sumer, Akkad, Uruk, vanished from human memory, surviving only as faint echoes in old scriptures. Tonight, we are going back. Back beyond the edge of remembered history to the place where the story of civilization itself begins. This is the entire story of ancient Mesopotamia, the first civilization on Earth. Before we begin, let yourself settle. Lower the lights, let your shoulders soften, and if you feel like it, leave a comment saying where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there. Now, let the rivers carry you back. The story begins with water. Two rivers rise in the cold mountains of what is now eastern Turkey, fed by snowmelt and spring rain, and they run south and east for more than 1,000 miles toward the warm shallows of the Persian Gulf. The river to the west the Greeks called the Euphrates. The river to the east they called the Tigris. Between them lies a plain so flat that a person standing on a rooftop can watch a storm approach for half a day before the first drop of rain arrives. In the north, the land rolls gently, and enough rain falls in winter to coax wheat and barley from the soil. But in the south, where our story truly begins, the rain almost never comes. Summer temperatures climb past 110 degrees. The earth bakes into a cracked, pale crust. There is no stone to quarry, no forest to cut, no copper or gold in the ground. By every reasonable measure, southern Mesopotamia should have been one of the last places on Earth where civilization was born. Instead, it was the first. The secret lay in the rivers themselves, each spring swollen with mountain snowmelt. The Tigris and Euphrates rose over their banks and spread across the plain, laying down a fresh layer of silt so fine and so rich that a single planted seed of barley could return 70 grains, sometimes more. Nowhere else in the ancient world was the soil so generous. But the rivers gave with one hand and took with the other. Their floods came in April and May, exactly the wrong time, when the young crops were already standing in the fields, and the floods were violent and unpredictable, especially on the Tigris, which could rise without warning and drown whole districts in a single night. The people who came to live on this plain learned, slowly over centuries, that the rivers could not simply be endured. They had to be managed. Canals had to be dug to carry water to the fields in the dry months. Dikes had to be raised to hold the floods back. Basins had to be scooped out to store the precious water. And none of this could be done by a single family, or even a single village. It took hundreds of hands working together, season after season, generation after generation. Some historians believe this is the deep root of everything that followed. The rivers forced people to organize. Organization demanded leaders and record-keeping and rules, and out of that necessity, drop by drop, field by field, civilization began to gather like water behind a dike. The plain itself was a strange and beautiful place in those distant days, where the rivers approached the sea. They dissolved into a vast world of marshes, tens of thousands of acres of still green water, and giant reeds growing twice the height of a man. Wild boar moved through the reed beds. Pelicans and herons stalked the shallows. Enormous carp hung in the warm water, and in the evening the whole marsh flickered with birds coming home to roost. The people of the marshes lived on islands of woven reeds, in houses of woven reeds, poling narrow boats of bundled reeds through channels only they could navigate. Their way of life proved so perfectly suited to that world that it endured, almost unchanged, into living memory. The marsh Arabs of southern Iraq, draining away only in recent decades, were still building the same arched reed houses that appear on clay tablets 5,000 years old. Beyond the marshes, on the open plain, there were date palms, heavy with sweet fruit in autumn, and tamarisk trees casting thin shade, and endless whispering grasses where gazelle grazed, and lions, yes, lions, hunted in the thickets along the riverbanks. The kings of this land would still be hunting lions from their chariots 3,000 years later. This was the stage on which the first act of human history would be performed. A hot, flat, stoneless, treeless plain, crossed by two moody rivers, fringed by marsh and desert. It offered nothing except mud, water, reeds, and sunlight. And from those four humble ingredients, the people of Mesopotamia would build everything. Houses of mud, temples of mud, cities of mud, libraries of mud. An entire world of mud raised up toward heaven, and stamped, while it was still wet, with the first written thoughts of humankind. It is worth pausing before the first villages appear to feel how old this landscape truly is. Long before any human being walked between the rivers, the plain itself did not exist. The whole southern basin was a shallow arm of the sea, and over hundreds of thousands of years, the Tigris and Euphrates slowly filled it in, carrying down the mountains grain by grain, and laying them at the water's edge. The land the first settlers walked upon was, in the most literal sense, made by the rivers, delivered from the highlands one flood at a time. Even in historical ages, the shoreline kept creeping southward, so that cities founded on the coast found themselves, centuries later, stranded far inland. Their harbours turned to dust. The climate, too, was gentler once. In the ages just after the last ice age, monsoon rains reached farther north than they do today, and much of the region drank deeply every winter. Then, slowly, the rains withdrew. The grasslands thinned. The herds of wild cattle and gazelle drew in toward the rivers, and the scattered human bands who hunted them followed. Some scholars believe this slow drying of the land was one of the quiet engines of history, pressing people and animals and water together into the river valleys until something new was forced into being. And to the north and east of the plain rose the great arc of hills that archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent, curving like a crescent moon from the Persian Gulf, up through the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, across northern Mesopotamia, and down the Mediterranean coast. In those hills grew the wild ancestors of wheat and barley, swaying in stands so thick that a family with flint sickles could gather a year of grain in a few weeks. There, too, lived the wild sheep, the wild goats, the wild pigs and cattle that would one day fill the world's farms. The hills were the nursery. The plain below, hot and hard and rich, would be the proving ground when the people of the hills finally carried their seeds and their flocks down onto the flat land between the rivers. They were walking into the greatest gamble of the human story, so far, trading the safety of varied wild foods for total dependence on the flood, the canal, and the harvest. It was a gamble that would be lost by many and won, spectacularly, by a few, and the winners would change the world. And there is one more feature of this landscape you should carry with you through the whole story: the mud itself. To us, mud is a nuisance. To Mesopotamia, it was iron and marble and paper, all at once, mixed with chopped straw and pressed into wooden moulds. It dried in the ferocious sun into bricks that could be stacked into anything. And when a wall crumbled, as every wall eventually did, its ruins became the foundation of the next, so that the cities literally rose on their own pasts, layer upon layer, decade upon decade, until each one stood on a hill made entirely of its former selves. Archaeologists slicing down through such a mound are cutting through time itself, floor above floor, hearth above hearth, 40 generations deep. Nowhere else on Earth did a civilization so completely build itself out of the ground it stood on, and nowhere else did the ground so faithfully keep the receipts. No one knows the name of the first farmer, but we know roughly where and when the great change began. Around 10,000 years before our time, in the rain-fed hills of the Fertile Crescent, people who had gathered wild grain for generations began deliberately to plant it. It sounds like a small thing, a handful of seeds pressed into the soil, a season of waiting, a harvest, but it was the single most consequential decision human beings had made since leaving Africa. A hunting band must keep moving, following the herds and the seasons. A farming family must stay, watching over its field, the way a mother watches over a sleeping child. And so, for the first time, people built houses meant to last, of packed mud and timber and stone. Villages appeared, small clusters of a few dozen homes, warm with smoke and the smell of baking bread. Grain could be stored, and stored grain meant something no hunter had ever really possessed: a surplus, a cushion against hunger, wealth that could be kept, measured, traded, envied and stolen. The animals came next. Sheep and goats first, then pigs, then the great wild cattle called aurochs, tamed over generations until they consented to pull and carry and be milked. A village with fields and flocks was a new kind of human world. Children grew up knowing every path and every neighbour. The old could stay in one place and be cared for. Pots could be shaped from clay and fired hard, too heavy for a wandering life, but perfect for a settled one, and soon painted with patterns of such elegance that archaeologists can trace whole cultures by their pottery. Alone, for thousands of years, this village world spread and ripened through the hills of the north. And then, somewhere around 6,000 years before the Common Era, families began to drift south, down out of the rainlands, onto the great hot plain of Sumer, where rain alone could never grow a crop. Why they went, no one can say for certain. Perhaps the hills were filling up, perhaps drought pushed them. Perhaps some restless soul simply followed the river and saw what soil like that could do. The earliest southern settlements we know belong to what scholars call the Ubaid culture, named for a small mound near Ur, where their traces were first found. The Ubaid people were modest folk. They lived in rectangular houses of mud brick, fished the marshes, herded on the plain's edge, and cut the first small canals to lead river water onto their barley fields. And in each of their villages, from very early on, one building stood apart, a little larger, a little finer, set on a low platform of packed earth. It was a shrine, a house for a god, in the village of Eridu, near the ancient shoreline. Archaeologists dug down through 18 levels of temples, each built upon the ruins of the last. And, at the very bottom, beneath temples of the historical age, they found a tiny room of mud brick, hardly bigger than a garden shed, with an altar and a pedestal and a scattering of fish bones, offerings to the water god, left by worshippers before history began. The Sumerians themselves would later say that Eridu was the oldest city in the world, the place where kingship first descended from heaven. Standing at the bottom of that trench, looking at that little shrine, it is hard to argue with them. Century by century, the Ubaid villages grew. Their canals lengthened and branched. Their platforms rose higher. Their potters began to use a slow turning wheel, one of the first appearances of the wheel anywhere on Earth. Not on a cart, but in a workshop spinning wet clay between patient hands. Their traders ranged astonishing distances for such a simple age, for the plain, remember, had no stone, no metal, no hard timber, and everything of that kind had to come from somewhere else. Obsidian arrived from the mountains of Anatolia, hundreds of miles to the north. Copper came from the Iranian plateau. Shells came up from the Gulf. In exchange, the plain sent out what it had in abundance: grain, wool, cloth, dates, dried fish, the humble produce of mud and water that would remain Mesopotamia's wealth for all time. Slowly, some villages became towns. A town needed more canals, and the canals needed organizing, and the organizing gathered around the temple, where the god watched over the fields and the priests watched over the storehouses. By around 4,000 years, before the Common Era, the largest of these towns held perhaps a few thousand people. More human beings living together than the world had ever seen in one place. The evenings there must have sounded almost like our own. Dogs barking, children called home at dusk, the knock of a potter's tool, a neighbour's argument drifting over a courtyard wall, and beneath it all the endless soft voice of the river, giving and threatening in the same breath. These people did not know they were building the threshold of history. They were only feeding their families, honouring their gods, and mending their dikes before the spring flood. But the pieces were now all in place: the fields, the surplus, the temple, the trade, the crowded streets. The plain was ready. Something enormous was about to happen at a place called Uruk. Before we leave these first farmers, it is worth lingering a moment on how their world actually felt, because sleep stories are made of such things. Imagine a Ubaid village at the end of a day in early summer, 5,500 years before the Common Era. The sun has gone down behind the flat western horizon, and the sky above the marshes has turned the colour of ripe apricots. The barley harvest is in, and the threshing floors at the edge of the village still smell of chaff and warm straw. A woman kneels at a saddle-shaped grinding stone, working the last of the day's flour, her arms moving in a rhythm her grandmother taught her mother. Nearby, a man patches a hairline crack in the courtyard wall with a handful of wet mud, smoothing it with his palm as tenderly as if he were dressing a wound. Because, in this country, the wall is always dissolving, and the mud is always ready, and the two of them have an old understanding. Down at the canal, boys splash and shout in the brown water, while a line of black goats picks its way home along the bank. Somewhere a flute made of reed is playing 3 or 4 notes over and over, and no one minds. In the largest house of the village, the one on the platform, an old priest sets a bowl of fresh fish before a small clay figure of the water god and murmurs words that are already ancient. He asks for the same things every human being has always asked for. Let the flood be gentle this year. Let the grain fill. Let the children live. Then the light thickens. The swallows give way to bats. The cooking fires burn down to red eyes in the dusk, and one by one the doorways go quiet. 5,500 years later, we still end our days almost exactly this way. Food, family, a little worry, a little prayer and sleep. Only the roofs have changed. Hold that village gently in your mind as you drift, because everything that follows, every king and tower and army in this long story, grew out of evenings just like that one, and was built to protect them. Everything after this, in a real sense, is only that village growing and never quite forgetting what it grew from, no matter how high the towers rose. If you could rise like a heron above the southern plain, around 3,500 years before the Common Era, you would see something that had never existed on Earth before. Among the green threads of the canals and the pale gold of the barley, one settlement had grown beyond all others. A dark, sprawling mass of rooftops and lanes and smoke, ringed by gardens and date groves, crowned at its centre by two towering temple precincts, whose whitewashed walls caught the sun like signal fires. This was Uruk, the world's first true city. At its height, Uruk covered more than 600 acres and may have held 40,000 people, perhaps more. To grasp what that meant, consider that most human beings alive at the time had never seen more than a few hundred people gathered in one place. A herder walking in from the steppe would have stood at Uruk's edge and simply stared at streets deeper than any canyon he knew, at crowds of strangers who did not know each other's names, and did not need to, at the roar, faint and constant, of thousands of lives being lived at once. Everything about the city was new, and much of it has never stopped. Uruk had specialists, people who spent their whole lives doing one thing, potters who made nothing but pots, weavers who made nothing but cloth, brewers, bakers, smiths, boatmen, gardeners, barbers, each depending on all the others in a web no single mind could hold. Uruk had administrators, temple officials, who gathered the grain of the countryside into vast storehouses and paid it back out as rations to workers. So much barley, so much oil, so much wool per person per month, measured in standard bowls of coarse clay, turned out by the tens of thousands. Archaeologists find those ration bowls everywhere in the ruins, stacked, discarded, broken, the paper cups of the first economy. Uruk had monuments. Generation after generation, the city rebuilt the two great sanctuaries at its heart, the precinct of Anu, the remote father of the sky, and the precinct of Inanna, the city's own beloved goddess, lady of love and abundance and war. Her temples were wonders, raised on high terraces, their walls decorated with hundreds of thousands of small clay cones dipped in red, white, and black, and pressed into wet plaster to form dazzling mosaics of zigzags and diamonds, so that whole facades shimmered like woven cloth turned to stone. Around the year 3100, the people of Uruk raised a wall around their city, nearly 6 miles of it, with hundreds of towers, and later legend insisted that the hero King Gilgamesh himself had built it. Inside that wall, the texture of daily life would be recognizable to any city dweller since. Narrow lanes wound between blank house walls, cool and shadowed at noon. Doorways opened into courtyards where women ground grain and gossiped across the walls. Peddlers cried their goods, scribes, a new kind of human being we shall meet properly in the next chapter, hurried between storehouses with tablets of damp clay under their arms. In the evening, on the flat rooftops, families ate bread and dates and onions, and watched the sky turn violet over the towers of Inanna, and the city hummed beneath them like a single enormous living thing, which is exactly what a city is. Uruk did not stay alone for long. The idea of the city, once loose in the world, spread along the rivers like fire along a fuse. Rose near the sea, and Eridu beside it. Lagash and Umma grew up glaring at each other across a disputed border. Nippur became the holy city of Enlil, lord of the gods, where kings would come for 1,000 years to have their crowns blessed. Kish rose in the north of the plain, Sippar and Shurupak along the middle rivers. By the early 3rd millennium, the land of Sumer, the southern plain, was a constellation of a dozen or more city-states, each a little world of its own, each with its patron god, its temple, its canals, its fields, and increasingly its army. For the cities, so close together on that flat, open plain, discovered rivalry almost as quickly as they discovered everything else. They quarrelled over water, the oldest quarrel in Mesopotamia over which city might cut a canal upstream of another. They quarrelled over borderland barley fields and the border stones that marked them. And we possess, on a battered clay cylinder, the terms of the boundary dispute between Lagash and Umma, the first international conflict in recorded history, complete with treaties made and treaties broken, a war fought over a strip of farmland called the Gwedena, the edge of the plain, the stele of the vultures, carved for a king of Lagash named Eanatum, shows the result, a phalanx of helmeted spearmen marching shield to shield over the bodies of their enemies, while vultures carry off heads in their beaks. It is the oldest picture of an army in the world, and it is already unmistakably an army, and yet war was the exception, not the rule. What held the Sumerian world together was a shared civilization stronger than any quarrel. Every city spoke Sumerian, a language related to no other we know, as strange and alone in history as the people were inventive. Every city honoured the same great gods, told the same stories, kept the same festivals, measured with the same weights, and crucially wrote with the same script. A merchant of could walk the streets of Kish, 200 miles away, and feel at home. They called themselves, in their own tongue, the Black-Headed People, and they knew, with a confidence that still radiates from their inscriptions, that their way of life was the way human beings were meant to live. Kingship, they said, had descended from heaven. First to Eridu, then, city by city, wherever the gods willed. It never occurred to them that it had, in fact, ascended from the mud, from the canal gangs, from the storehouse tallies, from 10,000 ordinary evenings on the rooftops of Uruk. We should also pause over the invention that made all of this movement possible, because it happened here in these centuries, and the world has never stopped using it. Somewhere on this plain, most likely, a potter's turntable was tipped on its side, fitted to an axle, and set under a sledge, and the wheel began to roll. The earliest images of wheeled vehicles anywhere on Earth come from Mesopotamia. Lumbering war wagons and ox carts on solid wooden disc wheels, slow and screeching, and the plain, flat as a threshing floor, was the perfect nursery for them. With the cart came the road, with the road came the widening world, and it is a pleasing thought, on the edge of sleep, that every wheel turning anywhere tonight, every car and train and quietly spinning fan, is descended from a potter's tool knocked sideways by some unremembered genius between the rivers. Add to it the sail, first raised on these same rivers, catching the wind that blows so reliably up the valley against the current, so that boats could ride the water down and ride the wind back. And you have the two great engines of all ancient movement, invented within sight of each other, in the same few centuries, on the same brown water. Hold that image of early Uruk a moment longer, the potter, the cart, the sail, the seal, the storehouse, and notice what they have in common. Every one of them is a way of trusting strangers, of letting your grain, your goods, your good name travel farther than your own 2 feet can follow, and that trust, more than any wall or weapon, is what a city actually is. Of all the gifts Mesopotamia gave the world, one stands above every other, and it began, of all places, in the warehouse. Picture the problem. The great temple of Inanna at Uruk owns thousands of acres of barley land, herds of sheep and cattle, orchards, fish ponds, workshops. Every day, goods flow in and rations flow out. jars of oil, bales of wool, baskets of dates, in quantities no human memory can hold. For a while, the storekeepers managed with clay tokens, little modelled shapes, a cone for a small measure of grain, a sphere for a large one, a disc for a sheep, sealed inside hollow clay balls as receipts. Then someone had the idea of pressing the tokens into the wet surface of the ball before sealing it, so the contents could be read from outside. And then, somewhere around 300 years before the Common Era, someone realized the tokens themselves were no longer necessary. You could simply draw the signs on a flat piece of clay that someone, whose name we will never know, invented writing. The earliest tablets from Uruk are pure bookkeeping, and there is something wonderful about that. Humanity's first written words are not a prayer, or a poem, or a king's boast. They are receipts. So many sheep, so many measures of barley, received or paid out, month such and such, signed with the seal of the official responsible. One of the oldest personal names ever written belongs not to a king or a god, but apparently to an accountant, a man scholars call Kushim, whose signature sits on tablets recording ingredients for brewing beer. The first named individual in human history may well have been a beer warehouse clerk. He, if he was a he, was probably not even slightly aware of being immortal. The script itself began as pictures, a drawn head of an ox for ox, an ear of barley for barley, a foot for walking, but drawing curves in wet clay is slow and smeary. And clay was the only writing material the plane possessed in abundance. So the scribes learned to press rather than draw, using the cut end of a reed stylus, and every sign dissolved into neat clusters of small wedge-shaped marks. Cuneiform, we call it, from the Latin for wedge. Over centuries, the pictures grew so stylized that no one could see the ox in the sign for ox anymore. And something far more important happened along the way. Scribes began to use signs for their sounds rather than their meanings. The way we might draw a bee and a leaf to mean belief. With that single leap, writing broke free of the storehouse. It could now record anything a human mouth could say: names, prayers, laws, letters, lies, lullabies. It could speak for the dead. Learning this art was brutal. A boy, and it was usually a boy, though we know of women scribes, and even a great woman poet, entered the tablet house as a small child and spent a dozen years copying lists, signs, words, proverbs, hymns, over and over, morning after morning, in a courtyard filled with the click and scrape of styluses. Because the students wrote about it, and their exercise tablets survive by the thousand. One famous composition follows a schoolboy through his day. He is late because he overslept. His mother gives him 2 rolls and he runs. At school he is caned for talking, caned for standing up, caned for sloppy handwriting, caned, it seems, for existing. In despair, the boy persuades his father to invite the schoolmaster home for dinner, where the great man is fed roast meat, given a fine garment and a ring, and, thus warmed, suddenly discovers that the boy is the most promising pupil he has ever taught. 4,000 years have not changed education as much as we like to think. But those who endured the tablet house entered a kind of aristocracy of the mind. A trained scribe could serve a temple, a palace, a merchant house, or the courts. He could draft a contract for the sale of a house, a field, a slave, complete with witnesses and sworn oaths. He could write a letter for a worried mother to a son far away. And among the surviving letters are some that need no translation of the heart. A merchant's wife asking why he never writes. A son assuring his mother that he is eating well. A student, in the oldest version of a message sent from every campus in history, explaining precisely why he needs more money. Writing spread across the whole fabric of life, and because it was written on clay, and clay, once fired, or even sun-dried, is nearly immortal. Mesopotamia became the best documented civilization of the ancient world. Papyrus rots, parchment burns, but a burned clay tablet only gets harder. When a Mesopotamian city was sacked, and its archives went up in flames, the fire baked the records solid, preserving, in the moment of destruction, everything the destroyers meant to erase. Today we possess hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets, and more come out of the ground every year. Tax rolls, treaties, recipes, medical texts, star charts, multiplication tables, jokes, curses, love charms. There are tablets recording the wages of female weavers, tablets diagramming the geometry of canals, a tablet from a boy named Idin Sin to his mother complaining, with magnificent teenage indignation, that other boys' mothers send them nicer clothes than his, and writing gave Mesopotamia one thing more, the deepest thing. It gave time a shape. Kings could now be listed in order, year names recorded, omens tied to dates, and the past held still long enough to be studied. The Sumerians compiled the first king lists, stretching back, with reigns of fantastic length, into the mists before the flood. History, as an idea, as a story written down that outlives everyone in it, begins between the rivers. Everything you are hearing tonight, every name and date and battle across 5,000 years. You are hearing because a clerk in a barley warehouse on an ordinary hot afternoon in Uruk pressed the first marks into a piece of wet clay, and the clay remembered. One more marvel of Uruk deserves its moment, the cylinder seal, an invention so characteristic of this civilization that archaeologists can almost date a site by them alone. It was a small cylinder of carved stone, an inch or so high, pierced to hang on a pin or a cord, and when rolled across wet clay, it left behind a continuous miniature frieze, heroes gripping lions, rows of temple cattle, gods on their thrones, scenes carved in reverse with breathtaking skill into a surface smaller than your thumb. Every person of consequence had one. It was signature, identity card, and jewellery in a single object, worn at the wrist or the neck for a lifetime, and often buried with its owner. Officials rolled them across storeroom doors, sealed with clay, across the stoppers of jars, across contracts, and to break a ceiling was to break the law. Tens of thousands survive, and under a magnifying glass, each one opens like a tiny window, a whole scene of worship or myth or daily labour, rolled out 4,500 years ago by a hand asserting the newest idea in the world. This is mine. This was witnessed. This is who I am. It is worth adding that we can read all of this today only because of one final gift of the tablet houses, their stubborn conservatism. Long after Sumerian died as a spoken language, the schools went on teaching it, the way Latin was taught in Europe for centuries after Rome, because the oldest prayers and classics were in Sumerian. And the gods, it was felt, preferred it. So the scribes compiled sign lists and dictionaries, Sumerian words with their Akkadian translations, column against column, tablet after tablet, the first bilingual dictionaries on Earth. And when modern scholars finally cracked Akkadian in the 19th century, those ancient homework aids were waiting in the ruins, and the schoolmasters of Babylon, dead for millennia, reached out and taught one more class, guiding living scholars on into a language no one had heard since before the pyramids were old. Every Sumerian text read today is read through the patient labour of those long-dead teachers, which would have pleased them enormously, and which they would have regarded, no doubt, as no more than their due. To understand Mesopotamia, you must understand one thing above all. Every city belonged, first and last, to a god. Not symbolically, not poetically, but legally and literally. Uruk was the household of Inanna. Ur belonged to Nanna, the moon. Nippur belonged to Enlil, lord of the wind and of the destinies. The fields were the gods' fields, the storehouses, the gods' storehouses, and the human beings of the city were, in the plainest terms of their own myths, the gods' servants, created for a purpose that Mesopotamian poetry states with disarming honesty. The gods, the old stories said, grew tired of digging their own canals and growing their own food, and so mankind was fashioned from clay and the blood of a slain god, to take up the toil, to work the earth, to fill the offering tables, so that the gods might rest. It is perhaps the least flattering creation story ever told, and yet there is a strange tenderness in it, for it made every ordinary labourer part of the maintenance of the cosmos. When you dredged a canal or baked a loaf for the temple, you were, in a small way, holding up the sky. The gods themselves were imagined with unblinking realism, as a vast and quarrelsome aristocratic family. An, the distant father of heaven. Enlil, the executive power whose word could not be unsaid, who sent both the fruitful wind and the destroying storm. Enki, god of the sweet waters under the earth, the clever one, the friend of mankind, forever finding loopholes in the harsh decrees of his brothers. Hu to the sun, who saw everything that happened by day, and so became the lord of justice. Nana the moon, who measured the months. And Inanna, later called Ishtar, the most vivid personality in the whole pantheon, goddess of desire and of battle, radiant, jealous, generous, terrifying, the morning and evening star. The stories told about her, how she descended into the underworld and hung dead on a hook for 3 days before rising again. How she tricked Enki, cup by cup of beer, into giving her all the arts of civilization, are among the oldest surviving literature on Earth, and some were written down by the oldest named author in history. A princess and high priestess called Enheduanna, daughter of a king we shall soon meet, whose hymns to Inanna carry, across 43 centuries, an unmistakable individual voice. Above every city, the god's house rose in the form Mesopotamia made its signature, the ziggurat. It was not a pyramid, though it is often confused with one, and it held no tombs. A ziggurat was a stepped mountain of solid mud brick, terrace upon terrace, climbing toward a small high temple at the summit, where the god might descend to meet the world. The great ziggurat of Ur, whose core still stands today, rose in 3 vast stages faced with millions of baked bricks set in bitumen, its walls gently curved by architects who understood, thousands of years before the Greeks, that a perfectly straight line looks weak to the human eye. Its stairways, converging in a single grand flight, were built for processions, priests and kings ascending with music and incense into the sky. In a land table, flat to every horizon, the ziggurat was visible from hours away, shimmering above the palm groves, and a traveller on the plain always knew where the city was, and whose it was, by the mountain its people had raised by hand. Around the ziggurat spread the temple complex, and it was less like a church than like a corporation, a palace, and a welfare office combined. The temple owned estates and workshops. It employed armies of weavers, brewers, herdsmen, and clerks. It lent seed grain to farmers, supported widows and orphans, and fed the god twice a day in ceremonies of great solemnity: roast meat, bread, dates, honey, beer, set before the divine statue, while musicians played. After which, the god having taken the invisible essence of the meal, the food went, quite practically, to the priests and the palace. The statue at the heart of it all was not, to its worshippers, a mere image. Through secret rituals called the washing and the opening of the mouth, the god was believed to come and dwell within it, to see through its inlaid eyes. When a city fell in war, the victors would carry off the statue of its god, and the whole land would mourn, not for a stolen treasure, but for a divine presence gone into exile. Chronicles measure some eras by how long a god remained a prisoner in a foreign land, and the return of a captured statue could seal a peace between kingdoms. Beneath the great gods, the world swarmed with lesser powers, demons of the dust storm and the fever, protective spirits of the doorway, and for each person, a personal god, a kind of divine guardian, who might carry one's prayers upward, and whom one might reproach in bitter times like a disappointing friend. Ordinary faith was intimate in this way. People bore names that were small prayers, names meaning the God has heard, or sin is my strength, or plaintively, why have I been treated so? They wore amulets, poured out beer for the dead, and left in the temples small statues of themselves, wide-eyed, hands clasped, to stand in perpetual prayer before the god while they went about their lives, stone stand-ins whispering on their owner's behalf forever. And twice a year the whole city gave itself to festival. At the new year in Babylon of later days, the great statues travelled by barge and by procession along a street paved for them. The creation epic was recited from beginning to end, and the king himself was led before the god, stripped of his regalia, struck across the face by the high priest, and made to swear that he had not sinned against the city, tears in his eyes being counted a favourable omen. For one night the world was made new, order was reaffirmed over chaos, and every ordinary family, watching the torches pass, felt the year turn safely on its hinge. The gods of Mesopotamia demanded much, but they gave the plain what every human community needs even more than water, a story that made the labour mean something, and a mountain in the middle of the flatness, pointing up. And the gods travelled. When Sargon's Akkadians rose, Sumerian Inanna merged with Semitic Ishtar, and went on gathering names and cities for 2,000 years. When Babylon rose, its young god Marduk absorbed the powers and titles of the elders. 50 names were recited in his honour, and the theologians of Babylon, in a text of astonishing subtlety, even proposed that the other great gods were aspects of Marduk himself. Nergal being Marduk of battle, Nebu being Marduk of accounting, an early groping, some scholars think, toward the idea that the divine might ultimately be one. Assyria answered by setting its own god Ashur into Marduk's role in the creation epic, a theological coup carried out with a scribe's eraser. Gods rose and fell with their cities, were captured, ransomed, married to each other in great state, and through it all the ordinary worshipper went on doing what worshippers do, lighting the lamp, saying the name, asking for health, rain, and children, in words that changed so little across 3,000 years, that the last prayers of Babylon would have been perfectly intelligible at Eridu, in the little fish-scented shrine where it all began. That continuity is worth a breath of wonder in itself. 3,000 years is 100 generations of grandmothers teaching granddaughters the same lamp, the same name, the same small hope, and no institution in the modern world, no nation, no church, no language, has yet lasted so long. Among the kings on the old Sumerian lists, one name kept gathering stories the way a riverbank gathers silt: Gilgamesh, lord of Uruk, who was said to have built the city's great wall, and to have been 2/3 god and 1/3 man, a proportion best not examined too closely. Whether a real king of that name once ruled Uruk, we cannot prove, though kings around him on the list have left inscriptions in the ground. So it is entirely possible. What is certain is that within a few centuries of his supposed reign, Gilgamesh had become the hero of the greatest story of the ancient world. A poem told and retold for 2,000 years, translated across languages and empires, copied by schoolboys from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, and then lost. utterly, for 2,000 more, until men digging in the ruins of an Assyrian library brought its broken tablets back into the light. The Epic of Gilgamesh, as we call it, begins not with a battle but with a complaint. Gilgamesh, young and glorious and insufferable, is wearing his city out. He out-wrestles the young men, exhausts them in contests, lets no bride alone on her wedding night, and the people of Uruk cry to heaven for relief. The gods, in their practical way, do not punish him. They balance him. From a pinch of clay they create his equal, a wild man called Enkidu, who runs with the gazelles on the steppe, drinks at their waterholes, and frees them from the hunter's traps. Enkidu is humanity before the city, innocent, immensely strong, and alone. His taming is one of the most curious and touching passages in ancient literature. A woman is sent out from Uruk, and after his days with her, the animals no longer accept him. He has become human, and there is no way back. She washes him, clothes him, teaches him to eat bread and drink beer, 7 jugs of it, at which, the poem notes with satisfaction, his heart grew light and his face shone. Then she leads him to the city, where he and Gilgamesh collide in a wrestling match that shakes the doorposts, and when neither can throw the other, they do what young men have done after a good fight in every age. They become inseparable friends. What follows is adventure on the grandest scale. The 2 heroes travel to the far cedar forest to slay its guardian, the monstrous Humbaba, whose face is a coil of intestines and whose voice is the flood. They kill the bull of heaven when the goddess Ishtar, furious that Gilgamesh has rejected her advances by rudely listing the fates of her former lovers, sends it to trample Uruk. They stand back to back against everything the world can send, and they win, and they are unbearable in victory, and the gods decide that a price must be paid. Enkidu falls ill. Not in battle, not gloriously, but slowly, in bed over 12 days, while Gilgamesh watches helplessly. And with his friend's death, the poem turns from adventure into something no story had ever been before, an inquiry into mortality itself. Gilgamesh cannot accept it. He touches Enkidu's heart, and it does not beat. He refuses to allow the burial for 6 days and 7 nights, until, in the poem's most pitiless line, a worm falls from the dead man's nose. Then the king of Uruk tears off his royal robes, clothes himself in the skin of a lion, and walks out of his own story into the wilderness to find the one man who never died. That man is Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood, to whom the gods granted eternal life, dwelling at the far edge of the world. To reach him, Gilgamesh passes through the mountain tunnel of the sun, through 12 leagues of absolute darkness, and across the waters of death, and when at last he stands before the immortal and demands his secret, Utnapishtim tells him a story. Long ago, he says, the gods resolved to destroy mankind with a flood, for humanity had grown so numerous and so noisy that the gods could not sleep. But clever Enki warned one good man, whispering through the wall of a reed hut. Tear down your house, he said, and build a boat. Take the seed of every living thing. The rains came, so terrible that the gods themselves fled to the highest heaven and crouched there like frightened dogs. For 6 days and 7 nights the storm erased the world. Then it passed, and the boat came to rest on a mountain, and Utnapishtim released a dove, which returned, then a swallow, which returned, and then a raven, which found land and did not come back. If that story sounds familiar, it should. It was written down more than 1,000 years before the oldest books of the Bible, and when a British museum assistant named George Smith first deciphered the flood tablet in the year 1872 and realised what he was reading, he reportedly leapt from his chair in excitement and began, to the alarm of his colleagues, removing his clothes. Utnapishtim's point however, is not triumph but gentleness. His immortality was a one-time gift of the gods, never to be repeated. Death is woven into mankind. Even so, he offers Gilgamesh a test. Merely stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, and immortality might be discussed. Gilgamesh, exhausted by his journey, sits down and falls asleep almost at once, and sleeps for a week, while loaves of bread are baked and set beside him. One for each day, going stale in a row, so that when he wakes he cannot deny how long he slept. Even then he is granted one last chance, a plant at the bottom of the sea that restores youth. He dives, he plucks it, and on the road home, while he bathes in a cool pool, a snake glides out of the grass and eats it, which is why, the poem says, snakes shed their skin and are made new, and men are not. And so Gilgamesh comes home to Uruk with nothing. Except that the poem does not end in despair. It ends where it began, with the wall. Climb the wall of Uruk, the poet says. Walk its length. Examine its foundations, the brickwork, how fine it is. This city, these fields, these people, this is what a mortal can build, and it is enough. 4,000 years before our sleepless, striving age. A poet between the rivers looked at the human condition without flinching, and offered the oldest consolation in literature. You will not live forever. Build something anyway, love your friend. Eat your bread, and when the week of grief has passed, wash your face, put on clean clothes, and go home to your city. The poem's afterlife is a story in itself. Gilgamesh crossed every border of the ancient world, translated into Hittite and Hurrian. Quoted in schoolrooms from Anatolia to Elam, a fragment of it found even at Megiddo in the land of Canaan. And faint echoes of the wild man and the flood and the plant of life sound on through the scriptures and legends of half the world. Alexander the Great chased the waters of life in later legend as Gilgamesh had. And some scholars hear the old king again, behind Hercules, behind Odysseus visiting the dead, behind the very idea that a hero's story should be about what the hero learns rather than what he wins. Then it all went under the mound with everything else. And the most read story of the ancient world became the least read story on Earth for 2,000 years. Until the tablets rose again, and readers by the million discovered that the oldest epic we have is about a man learning to accept that he will die, and found, somewhat to their surprise, that it still works. For all their shared civilization, the Sumerian cities never united themselves. It took an outsider to do that, and history remembers him, with reason, as the first empire builder on Earth. His name was Sargon, and even his name is a claim rather than a fact. For Sharukin, in his own Akkadian tongue, means simply the true king, which is exactly what a man says when he knows perfectly well that he is not. The legends that gathered around his birth are telling. His mother, one tradition says, was a priestess who was not permitted to keep a child. She bore him in secret, laid him in a basket of reeds sealed with bitumen, and set him on the river which carried him down to a gardener named Aki, who drew him from the water and raised him to tend the palm groves. If that story reminds you of a certain baby in the bulrushes of a later scripture, you have grasped how long stories can travel between the rivers. The historical footholds are only slightly firmer. Sargon rose, the chronicles say, to be cupbearer to the king of Kish, a position far more powerful than it sounds, close to the royal ear and the royal food. Around the year 2334 before the Common Era, by our best guesses, he made his move, and within a few years this gardener's foster son had done what no lord of Uruk or Ur had ever managed. He conquered them all. The proud old cities of Sumer fell to him one by one, their walls broken, their kings led away in neck stocks to be displayed before the god Enlil at Nippur. 54 battles are attributed to him. And his inscriptions add, with grim satisfaction, that he washed his weapons in the sea, meaning he had marched from one edge of the known world to the other, from the Persian Gulf toward the Mediterranean, mastering the plain entire. What Sargon built was something genuinely new under the sun, an empire, many peoples, many cities, many gods, under a single crown, and he seems to have understood, with startling speed, that conquering is the easy part. He appointed citizens of Akkad, his own people, as governors in the conquered cities. He kept, his inscriptions boast, 5,400 men eating bread daily before him, which historians read as the first standing army. Soldiers who did nothing but soldier, fed from the king's own stores. He standardized weights and measures across his domains, so that a merchant's shekel weighed the same in every market. He made Akkadian, his Semitic language, the language of administration, alongside venerable Sumerian, beginning a long marriage of tongues in which each borrowed constantly from the other. And in one of the most far-sighted political acts of the ancient world, he reached into religion itself, installing his daughter, Enhediwana, as High Priestess of the Moon God at Ur, the holiest office in the Deep South. She was a hostage of sorts, a symbol of unity certainly, and, as we have heard, a poet of genius, whose hymns wove the goddess of Akkad and the goddess of Sumer into one, doing with verse what her father did with armies. At the centre of it all he built a capital, Agad, the city of Akkad, whose harbours, the poets sang, were crowded with ships from lands as far as Dilmun and Magan and Maluha, which is to say Bahrain, Oman, and, most astonishingly, the cities of the Indus Valley in distant India. For a golden generation, Akkad was the centre of the world, its storehouses bursting, its quays loud with foreign tongues, its markets glittering with lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan, and carnelian from beyond the eastern sea. And here is one of history's small cruel jokes. Agade, the first imperial capital on earth, is the one great Mesopotamian city archaeologists have never found. It lies somewhere under the silt of central Iraq, waiting. Sargon reigned, tradition says, 56 years, long enough to see the conquered cities rise against him in his old age and to crush them one last time. His sons held the empire by force, putting down revolt after revolt, for the old cities never loved the crown that unified them. Then his grandson, Naram-Sin, raised the empire to its blazing noon. Naram-Sin took a step even Sargon had not dared. He declared himself a god, the god of Akkad, and had his name written with the divine star before it, and his victory stele, which you can see today in the Louvre, shows him twice the height of his soldiers, climbing a mountain over the bodies of his enemies, wearing the horned crown that belonged, before him, only to heaven. Later ages never forgave him for it. When the empire fell, and it fell within a generation or two of his death, the priests knew exactly whom to blame. A great lament called The Curse of Agade told how Naram-Sin had sinned against the temple of Enlil, and how the furious god had called down from the eastern mountains a barbarian horde, the Gutians, people, the poem shudders, with human intelligence but the instincts of dogs, who broke the empire and choked the roads, and let the canals silt up, so that grass grew on the highways and famine sat down in the marketplaces. The truth, as far as we can reconstruct it, was less poetic and more modern. A severe and prolonged drought, visible now in climate records from cave-sheave formations and sea sediments, struck the whole Near East around this time, withering the rain-fed north that fed the empire's cities. The Gutians were less a conquering horde than opportunists moving through a collapsing system. Empires, the first one included, are thirsty creatures, and when the rain failed, the whole vast machine of governors and garrisons and grain ships seized up and broke apart within a century. Agade the Glorious was a byword for ruin. But something had changed permanently. Every ambitious king in Mesopotamia for the next 2,000 years measured himself against Sargon. His legend was copied in the schools, his birth story retold, his title, King of the Four Quarters of the World, claimed by conquerors down to the end of cuneiform civilization. Once the idea of empire had been spoken aloud, it could never be unthought. The gardener's boy from the river had set a pattern that Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and Rome itself would follow, each in its turn, down all the centuries of this story, and well beyond its end. Historians love to argue about how much of Sargon's legend is fact, and the honest answer is that the empire is real. Its tablets and its ruins are in the ground, while the man himself flickers at the edge of the light. Half document, half campfire story, which is exactly what you would expect of the first person in history to become a legend in his own right. What no one disputes is the scale of the change he made. Before Sargon, the world was a mosaic of cities, each a god's household. After him, it was a place where empires were possible, where a single will could reach across hundreds of miles and dozens of peoples, for good and for ill, and mostly, the conquered would have said, for ill. The lament writers of Sumer, mourning what the Akkadians broke, invented in the process something almost as durable as empire itself. The literature of the defeated, the long tradition of giving grief a voice that outlasts the victor's inscriptions. And that tradition, too, begins between the rivers, in the smoking wake of the world's first conqueror, 50 centuries later. His name is still the first word in the long dictionary of empire, and the river still runs past the reeds where the legend says the basket came ashore. When the dust of Akkad's fall had settled and the Gutian interlude passed, the light of civilization gathered once more in the deep south, in the moon god's city of for one last, brilliant Sumerian summer. Around the year 2112, before the Common Era, a governor named Ur-Nammu made himself king, and he and his son Shulgi built, in the space of 2 lifetimes, the most meticulously organized state the ancient world would ever know. Historians call it the Third Dynasty of or simply Ur-3, and its ruins and records make you feel, more than any other corner of antiquity, that you are looking at a modern government in ancient dress. Ur-Nammu was a builder in every sense. It was he who raised the great ziggurat of whose mighty core still dominates the desert today. He who dug canals and restored the roads, and he who issued the oldest law code yet discovered anywhere on earth, 3 centuries before the more famous Hammurabi. Its preamble declares principles that still sound like justice. The orphan was not to be given over to the rich. The widow was not to be given over to the powerful. The man of 1 shekel was not to be given over to the man of 1 mina, which is to say 60 times richer. And strikingly, where later codes would demand an eye for an eye, Ur-Nammu's laws mostly imposed fines, measured in silver for injuries, a cooler, and in some ways more civilized instrument than the vengeance that came after. His son Shulgi reigned 48 years and organized everything a state can organize. He standardized the calendar and the measures. He created something like a national archive, and the bureaucracy of Ur-3 wrote everything down. Everything. With an appetite for documentation that has left us tens of thousands of tablets from this dynasty alone, we possess receipts for single sheep delivered to temple kitchens, rosters of women weavers with their monthly wool and barley rations, records of the fodder issued to messengers' donkeys at way stations along the royal roads. One archive at a place called Pusrish Dagon was nothing but a livestock clearinghouse, processing the empire's animal deliveries day by day for decades. If a lamb changed hands anywhere in the kingdom, somewhere a clerk was pressing wedges into clay about it. Shulgi, never modest, had hymns composed describing himself as a prodigy of body and mind, a scholar who mastered the scribal art, a musician, a diviner, and famously a runner who claimed to have run from Nippur to and back some 200 miles in a single day through a hailstorm in time for festivals in both cities. Historians permit themselves a raised eyebrow, but behind the boasting stood real magnificence, and nothing shows it like the city of itself. In those years, a capital of perhaps 65,000 people, its harbours busy with Gulf trade, its ziggurat freshly faced and gleaming, its streets, some of them among the first in the world we know to have been touched by urban planning, and beneath those streets lay the city's older glory. For centuries earlier, in the royal cemetery of the city had buried its early kings and queens in a splendour that still takes the breath away. When archaeologists opened those tombs in the 20th century, they found the grave of a queen. Puabi, her name was, lying beneath a headdress of golden leaves and lapis lazuli. With her court around her, soldiers, musicians, ladies-in-waiting, dozens of attendants, who had gone down into the earth with their mistress, each with a small cup near their hand. Whether they drank poison willingly, in devotion, or were given no choice, the earth does not say. Beside them lay harps and lyres of extraordinary beauty, one adorned with a golden bull's head, with a beard of lapis. And when the strings of such instruments were restrung in modern times, the world heard, faintly, tones that had been silent for 4,500 years. This was the deep inheritance on which Earth-3 stood. And for about a century the system worked. The canals flowed, the archives filled, the ziggurat cast its long morning shadow over an orderly world. Then, as always between the rivers, the weaknesses began to show. The state was magnificent, but rigid, dependent on harvests that were slowly, invisibly failing. Centuries of irrigation had been quietly poisoning the fields, for river water carries dissolved salts, and in that hot flat land, with no rain to flush the soil, every flooding of a field left a little more salt behind. Wheat, the more delicate crop, gave way to salt-tolerant barley in the records, and then even the barley yields began to slip. Meanwhile, from the western deserts, a people the clerks called the Amorites, tent-dwellers, herders, people who, one scornful text insists, ate their meat raw and did not bury their dead properly, were drifting into the settled lands, first as labourers and soldiers, then as chiefs and settlers. The kings of built a wall, over 100 miles of it, across the neck of the land to keep them out. Walls of that kind have a perfect record in history. They have never once worked. The end, when it came from the east. The kingdom of Elam, in the mountains of Iran, had old scores to settle. As the harvests failed and the provinces fell away, an Elamite army came down onto the starving plain, and around the year 2004, before the Common Era, they took itself, sacked it from end to end, and led its last king, Ibisin, away to die in captivity in the mountains. Sumer never rose again as a political power, and yet the Sumerians gave their catastrophe one final, extraordinary gift. They wrote it into poetry. The Lament for composed in the ruin's shadow, is one of the most heartbreaking texts of the ancient world. It describes the storm of destruction passing over the land, the bodies in the streets where festivals had been, the old men and women who would not leave their houses and perished in the fire, and the moon god's own wife, the goddess Ningal, wandering weeping through her devastated city, crying out, My house, my city, they have destroyed. In the tablet houses of Babylon, students were still copying that lament centuries later, keeping the grief of alive long after the Sumerian language itself had died on every mother's tongue. It became a classic, a scripture of loss. The first civilization ended as it began, with words pressed into clay, and even its dying was literature. One administrative invention of this dynasty deserves a word of its own, because it still runs the world, the balanced account. The clerks of III did not merely record what came in. They recorded what should have come in, calculated the difference, and carried deficits forward against the responsible official year after year. And there are tablets on which a foreman's accumulated shortfall follows him like a shadow until his death, at which point, with perfect bureaucratic serenity, it is charged against his estate. Scholars who study these texts speak, without irony, of the world's first audits. It was a machine of remorseless clarity, and it is hard not to feel for the foreman, but it is equally hard not to be awed. For here, 4,000 years ago, is the full grammar of the modern institution, the target, the report, the review, the carried balance, the file that never forgets. When your accounts are reconciled tonight, somewhere in the deep ancestry of that reconciliations stands a tired man in with a reed stylus, adding up sheep, out of the long confusion that followed Ur's fall. While Amorite chieftains carved the plain into rival kingdoms, one city began its slow climb toward a name that would outshine them all. It was an unremarkable town on the Euphrates, in the middle of the land, and its name was Babylon. For its first centuries under Amorite kings, it was one player among many, and not the strongest. Mari up the river was richer. Larsa in the south was older. Ashur in the north was tougher. Then, in the year 1792, before the Common Era, or near enough, a young man inherited Babylon's modest throne, and his name was Hammurabi. He would need almost 30 years of patience before greatness found him. The letters and archives of the age, especially the astonishing diplomatic files dug up at Mari, show us the world he moved in with almost embarrassing intimacy. A chessboard of a dozen kings, allying, betraying, spying, marrying their daughters to each other and complaining about it afterward. One Mari official summed up the age in a sentence that has become famous. "There is no king who is strong by himself," he wrote. 10 or 15 kings follow Hammurabi of Babylon, and as many follow the kings of Larsa, of Eshnunna, of Katna, and 20 follow the king of Yamhad. Hammurabi, in that crowd, distinguished himself by waiting. He fortified, he dug canals, he signed alliances, and honoured them precisely as long as they were useful. And then, in his 30th year, the board tipped, and he moved with a speed that must have felt, to his neighbours, like a trap decades in the setting. Elam struck first, and Hammurabi, allied with Mari, threw the invaders back. Then, one by one, he turned on everyone else. Larsa fell after a long siege, and with it all the Old South. Eshnunna fell. And then, in a betrayal that still reads coldly off the tablets, he turned on Mari itself. His faithful ally of many years took it, and 2 years later had its magnificent palace, 300 rooms, the wonder of the age, burned to the ground. By his 38th year on the throne, the old warring board was simply gone. From the Persian Gulf, far up both rivers, everything obeyed Babylon, and the land between the rivers had acquired the name it would carry for the rest of antiquity, Babylonia. But conquest is not why the world remembers Hammurabi. Near the end of his life, he had a monument made, a finger of black diorite over 7 feet tall, polished like dark water. At its top, carved in relief, the king stands before the sun god Shamash, Lord of Justice, who sits enthroned with flames rising from his shoulders, handing the king the rod and ring of righteous rule. And below, in nearly 300 paragraphs of beautiful archaic cuneiform, flows the most famous law code of the ancient world. If a man puts out the eye of another man, they shall put out his eye. If he breaks another man's bone, they shall break his bone. If a builder builds a house and the house collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. If a boatman is careless and sinks the boat, he shall replace the boat. If a surgeon operates with the bronze lancet and saves a nobleman's eye, he shall receive 10 shekels of silver. If the patient dies, they shall cut off his hand. It is a whole world in cross-section, wages and divorces, adoptions and tavern-keeping, runaway slaves and negligent shepherds. And it is not, to our eyes, equal justice, for the penalty depended on rank. An injury to a nobleman cost an eye. The same injury to a commoner cost silver. Yet look closer, and the stone grows more humane than its reputation. Judges who falsified verdicts were expelled forever. False accusers suffered the penalty they had sought for the innocent. A wife could take her dowry and leave a cruel husband if the neighbourhood vouched for her conduct. A widow could not be thrown out of her home. And in the epilogue, Hammurabi states the purpose of it, all in words worth hearing, at full length across 37 centuries, that the strong might not oppress the weak, that justice might be done to the widow and the orphan. Let the wronged man who has a case come before this image of me, the King of Justice, and let him have the stone read aloud, and let it set his heart at ease. Where the daily life matched the poetry, tablets from the age suggest the courts were at least real and busy, full of sworn witnesses and cross-examinations and verdicts. And there is one more thing the stone teaches, quietly. It assumes everywhere that ordinary people, farmers, boatmen, tavern women, might have the law read aloud to them and demand its protection. Justice, between the rivers, was becoming public property. Hammurabi died around 1750, before the Common Era, an old man, master of everything from the Gulf to the Middle Euphrates, and his empire began to leak away almost at once. As personal empires do, his son spent his reign putting down revolts, and the Old South, salt-sick and rebellious, slipped from Babylon's grasp within a generation. The dynasty itself lingered for a century and a half, ruling a shrinking Middle Kingdom until an ending no one on the plain could have imagined. Far to the north, beyond the mountains in what is now Turkey, a new power called the Hittites had been sharpening itself, and around the year 1595, before the Common Era, their king Mursili led his army on one of the most audacious raids in ancient history, straight down the Euphrates, hundreds of miles from home, falling upon Babylon like lightning from a clear sky. He sacked the great city, seized the statue of its god Marduk, and then, having no way to hold a conquest so far from home, simply turned around and marched back into the mountains, leaving the first dynasty of Babylon dead on the ground behind him. It was less a conquest than a thunderclap. Yet, through all the wreckage that followed, one thing proved indestructible: the stone itself and the idea on it. 600 years after Hammurabi's death, an Elamite king carried the great diorite stele off to Susa as war plunder, where French archaeologists found it in the year 1901, and where it had stood all those centuries, silently repeating its epilogue to no one, that the strong might not oppress the weak. Kingdoms between the rivers rose, and burned and rose again, but from Hammurabi onward, every one of them had to answer, at least in words, to that sentence. Something else from Hammurabi's Babylon deserves remembering: the letters of the king himself, for dozens survive, dictated to his officials on the daily business of the realm, and they show us the ruler behind the stone. He orders a corrupt official sent to him in chains. He directs that a canal be dredged before the season turns. He grants a soldier's family relief from a creditor and rules on the case of a stolen ox, and demands to know why the temple shearers have not been paid. There is no majesty in these letters, no poetry, only an unresting attention to detail, the eye of a man who believed that justice was not a monument but a maintenance schedule, something done again every morning, canal by canal, case by case. The great black stone promises that the strong will not oppress the weak. The letters show what that promise cost, a lifetime of Tuesdays, and any ruler, or any parent, or any manager of anything at all will recognize the truth of it. The code is famous. The letters are the code, working. Let us step away from the kings for a while, and walk down into the streets. Because the deepest wonder of Mesopotamia is not its conquerors, but the sheer, warm, familiar humanity of its ordinary days, preserved in clay, with a completeness no other ancient world can match. Come into a city house of the age of Hammurabi. From the bright hammering heat of the lane, you pass through a single low doorway, and the temperature drops at once. For the house is built of thick mud brick around a small open courtyard, the rooms facing inward, windowless to the street, a cool private world turned away from the dust. The courtyard is the heart of everything. Here the cooking is done on a small clay oven and a brazier. Here water stands in great porous jars that sweat themselves cool. Here, in the fierce months of summer, the whole family carries its bedding up the stairs at dusk, and sleeps on the flat roof under the enormous desert stars, which is, if you have ever done it, one of the finest ways human beings have ever slept. The day begins, at first light, with the creak of the courtyard door and the slap of bread dough. Bread is everything. Flat barley loaves, pressed against the hot wall of the oven, eaten with onions, lentils, dates, a little fish from the canal, cheese, and on festival days mutton, rich and fatty from those famous Mesopotamian sheep. And with the bread, beer. Beer is not a luxury here. It is food, currency, medicine, and joy. Workers are paid in it, a litre or two a day for a labourer, more for the skilled. It is thick, cloudy, nourishing stuff, brewed at home and in taverns, mostly by women, drunk through long reed straws to keep the husks out of your teeth. And it has its own goddess, Ninkasi, in whose honour someone composed a hymn that is, in fact, a brewing recipe in verse, the oldest in the world, still followed successfully by modern brewers who have gone to the trouble. The proverb keepers, who wrote everything down, noted simply that not to know beer was not normal. Out in the lane, the city is at its business. The streets are narrow, shaded, loud, and honest about themselves. Water sellers cry their trade. A scribe sits by the gate, writing letters for hire. In the bazaar quarter, silver is weighed out in rings and coils, for coined money has not yet been invented, and every household owns a little set of stone weights, and every buyer, then as now, suspects every seller's weights of being lighter than his own. Contracts are everywhere. This civilization runs on them. Marriage contracts, apprenticeship contracts, contracts renting an ox for the ploughing season, contracts for houses sold, complete with the clay tablet deed sealed in a clay envelope against tampering. Down by the harbour, merchants are financing ventures that would not look strange on a modern trading floor. Silent partners putting up silver, active partners taking the caravan out, profit split by written agreement, losses argued over in court. We can even follow one family firm, the merchants of Ashur in the north, whose private letters, thousands of them, were dug up in far-off Anatolia, where they ran a tin and textile trade across 600 miles of mountains. In them, wives back home in Ashur write to husbands away at the trading post for years at a time, and the wives who wove the very cloth the firm sold, are formidable. "Send my silver," one writes. "You love only money and you hate your own life." And in the houses, the family. Marriage is arranged and contractual, but the letters and poems show plenty of warmth inside the arrangement, and the love songs, of which many survive, are frankly ardent. Children are treasured, worried over, and spoiled. One father's letter to a lazy son runs on for paragraphs of exasperated love that any parent tonight could sign. Babies wear amulets against the demon Lamashtu, who preys on the newborn. Little ones play with clay rattles, model chariots, miniature furniture for dolls. Boys with prospects go to the tablet house we have already visited. Girls mostly learn the great domestic economy at home, though some become priestesses, businesswomen, tavern keepers, midwives, and, here and there, scribes. Sickness brings the two kinds of healer, the Asu, with his salves and potions, some of them, like honey on wounds, genuinely effective, and the Ashipu, the exorcist, with his incantations, and a sensible family employs both, covering the visible and invisible worlds at once. Toothache, everyone knows, is caused by a worm that gnaws the gums, and there is a proper incantation for it, telling the worm's whole biography before ordering it out. In the evening, the family gathers on the roof again. Perhaps there is music, for this civilization loves its lyres and flutes and drums, and it has given the world something else no one else thought of: the heptatonic scale, 7 notes, tuned by written instruction, the distant ancestor of every song you have ever hummed. Perhaps someone tells riddles, or one of the fables everyone knows. The fox and the raven, the debate between the date palm and the tamarisk over which of them serves mankind best. Perhaps the old proverbs come out, wry and undeceived after 4,000 years. He who has silver is happy, he who has barley is content, but he who has nothing at all can sleep. The stars wheel slowly over the rooftops, the same stars whose movements the priests are charting from the temple towers, dividing the circle of the sky into 360 degrees, the hour into 60 minutes, the minute into 60 seconds, so that every clock face on earth tonight is quietly Mesopotamian. Somewhere a dog barks, somewhere a baby is hushed, somewhere a night watchman leans on his spear at the city gate. And the great story of kings and empires, which will resume shortly with the thunder of Assyrian chariots, matters, in the end, only because of this: the bread, the beer, the roof, the family sleeping in the warm dark, the small immortal music of an ordinary night between the rivers. And we should not leave the streets without meeting the women who ran so much of this world, because the tablets insist on them. Women in Mesopotamia could own property, lend money, run taverns and workshops, appear in court, and seal contracts with their own seals. And a class of cloistered women in old Babylonian Sippar, the Naditu, priestess businesswomen forbidden to marry in the ordinary way, became some of the shrewdest investors of the age, buying fields, financing harvests, leaving archives full of hard bargains sealed in their own names. Queens managed palace industries, employing hundreds of weavers. Wise women healed, midwives delivered, prophetesses spoke for the gods, and the alewife at her counter was such a fixture of civilization that, when Gilgamesh reaches the edge of the world, the last human being he meets, before the waters of death, is a divine barmaid, who gives him, unasked, the most sensible advice in the whole epic: let your clothes be clean, let your head be washed, cherish the child who holds your hand, and let your wife delight in your embrace, for this too is the work of mankind. The heroes ignore such advice, of course. That is what makes them heroes, and what makes the barmaid wise. So when this story returns now to its kings and its armies, keep the rooftop in the corner of your eye, because every date that follows was, for someone, only the year the baby walked, the year the flood was kind, the year the beer was especially good. After the Hittite thunderclap that ended Hammurabi's dynasty, Babylonia entered a long, strange, quiet age, and history's spotlight, which loves noise, tends to hurry past it. We should not. Into the vacuum came a mountain people called the Kassites, and here is the surprise. These supposed barbarians gave Babylonia over 4 centuries of rule, the longest-lasting dynasty in all its history. And they did it not by trampling the old civilization, but by falling in love with Kassite kings, restored the temples, patronized the scribes, honored Marduk, and presided over an age in which the classics were edited into the forms we now read, the Gilgamesh epic receiving its standard version from a scholar the tradition names as Sinleki Unnini, one of the first editors in world literature. It was under the Kassites, too, that Babylon settled permanently into its role as the sacred city, the cultural capital, the place that made kings legitimate, a role it would keep no matter who wore the crown, the way Rome would remain Rome long after the emperors moved away. And the world around Babylonia had grown up. This is the age historians call the Late Bronze Age, roughly the 15th to the 12th centuries, before the Common Era. And it was remarkably an age of international order. A club of great kings now ruled the Near East, Egypt of the pharaohs, the Hittites of Anatolia, the Mitanni of northern Mesopotamia, Kassite Babylonia, and, rising quietly in the north, Assyria. They called each other brother. They exchanged ambassadors, physicians, and princesses. They wrote to one another constantly, and by a marvellous accident we possess a whole file of their correspondence, found at Amarna in Egypt, and its language is not Egyptian. It is Babylonian cuneiform, the diplomatic tongue of the entire civilized world. Mi-wad, which means that scribes on the Nile spent years of their childhood learning the script invented in the warehouses of Uruk. The letters themselves are a delight, majestic and petty in the same breath. The king of Babylon complains that Pharaoh sent him too little gold, and that the gold he did send lost weight in the furnace. He complains that his sister, married into Egypt's harem, has not been seen by his messengers. Are you sure that woman you showed them was her? Pharaoh, for his part, loftily reminds his brother kings that gold in Egypt is as common as dust, and somehow never sends quite enough of it. Beneath the bickering, goods and ideas flowed on a scale the world had never seen. Copper from Cyprus, tin from the Far East, Mycenaean pottery, Egyptian linen, Babylonian astronomy, and along the coasts, in the port cities of the Levant, scribes weary of learning 600 cuneiform signs were experimenting with something dangerously simple. A script of only 2 or 3 dozen signs, one for each consonant, the seed of the alphabet, in which almost everything on earth is written tonight. Then, a little after the year 1200, before the Common Era, the whole radiant system collapsed. Historians still argue about the causes, and the honest answer is that there were many at once. A drying climate and years of famine, earthquakes along the fault lines, the snapping of trade routes, each of which made the next snap likelier. Peoples on the move, by land and sea. The mysterious sea peoples battering the coasts, and everywhere the smoke of burning palaces. The Hittite Empire, mighty for centuries, simply vanished. Mycenaean Greece fell into an illiterate dark age. Egypt staggered and shrank. The catastrophe was gentler in Mesopotamia proper, but the Kassite dynasty fell to an Elamite invasion around 1155. And it was in that raid that the Elamites carried home the loot of 1,000 years, including Naram-Sin's victory stele. and the law stone of Hammurabi itself, which is how both came to be waiting at Susa for the archaeologists. In the aftermath, a native Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar the first to bear that great name, marched into Elam in the murderous heat of summer, when no one campaigns, and brought back the captured statue of Marduk. In triumph, a rescue his people remembered for centuries, and it may have been in the glow of that restoration that a Babylonian poet composed the Enuma Elish, the great creation epic, telling how young Marduk slew the ocean dragon of chaos. Tiamat split her body like a shellfish to make heaven and earth, and was crowned king of all the gods, with Babylon and its temple raised at the centre of creation. Every new year thereafter, that poem was recited in full before the god, the city's declaration that out of chaos, order, and at the centre of order, Babylon. But the deep currents of the age were flowing northward, through all the chaos of the collapse. One power had bent and never broken, hardened, in fact, by centuries of standing alone on an open frontier with enemies on every side. On the upper Tigris, around the old merchant city of Ashur, and the growing war city of Nineveh, the Assyrians had learned the lessons of the dark time and drawn a grim conclusion from them. Never again be weak. Their farms fed sturdy peasant soldiers. Their kings campaigned year upon year as a religious duty to their god Ashur. Their craftsmen were mastering the new metal, iron, commoner than bronze and cheaper to arm a big army with, as the first millennium before the Common Era opened over the wounded Near East. The black basalt lions of Assyria were stirring, and the plain between the rivers was about to meet the most terrifying military machine of the ancient world. Before the storm breaks, spare a moment for what the collapse felt like from inside, because we have a document that shows us, and it is unforgettable. In the city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, a king wrote to the king of Cyprus begging for help. "The enemy ships have come," he says. "My cities are burned. My troops are away in Hittite country. My fleet is far off. The land is defenceless." Archaeologists found a version of that letter in the ruins of Ugarit, in a kiln or an archive room, where it lay as the city died around it, and Ugarit was never inhabited again. Across the whole eastern Mediterranean, the story repeats. Palaces burned with the dinner service. Still in the cupboards, hoards of treasure buried by owners who never came back. Scripts and crafts and whole languages dropping out of use in a single generation. Civilization, the Bronze Age learned, is a network, and a network can fail, all at once, each broken strand snapping two more. Mesopotamia, older and deeper rooted, bent where others broke, but it carried the lesson forward in its bones, and so should we, gently, on our way to sleep, with gratitude for every strand that held today, and spare a last thought for the letters that never got answers, the ambassadors on the road when the roads closed, the princesses far from home when home stopped writing, the merchants whose partners' cities were suddenly smoke on the horizon. The Great Collapse is a statistic in the histories, a bend in the graph of civilization, but it was lived, one silence at a time, one caravan that never came, one harbour empty at the season when the sails always used to show, the people between the rivers, watching the west burn from a distance, drew their families a little closer and mended their dikes, which is, in every age, most of what can be done, and it was enough, and the lamps of Babylon stayed lit. The world that woke from that long night would be a different world. Iron where bronze had been, alphabets beside the wedges, and a hard new wisdom in the north that would soon make itself felt everywhere. The Assyrian Empire at its height was the largest the world had yet seen, and it was built, quite openly, on fear. Its kings did not soften their methods in their inscriptions. They advertised them, carving into palace walls, for every visiting ambassador to study on his way to the throne room precisely what happened to cities that resisted. The flayings, the empalements, the pyramids of heads, rendered in exquisite low relief by some of the finest sculptors who ever lived. It was terror as policy, calculated to make the next city open its gates without a fight, and very often it worked. But to leave the description, there would be to miss what Assyria actually was, because behind the atrocity propaganda stood the most sophisticated state machine of antiquity. The Assyrian army was the first great iron army, tens of thousands strong, a professional corps of chariots, the world's first true cavalry. Engineers who could bridge rivers on inflated skins and bring down city walls with towers and rams, and a supply system that could keep all of it fed hundreds of miles from home. Behind the army ran the roads, with relay stations where royal messengers changed horses so that a dispatch could cross the empire in days, the direct ancestor of every postal system since. Behind the roads sat the governors, the tax rolls, the intelligence reports, and we have the archives, thousands of letters to the kings, from officials, spies, astrologers, and complainers, the daily inbox of a superpower. And behind everything stood the policy that most shaped the future. Mass deportation. Conquered peoples were uprooted wholesale, tens of thousands at a time, and marched to new lands, weavers to the cities, farmers to empty provinces, rebels far from home. It was brutal, and the reliefs show the trudging families with their carts and bundles. It was also, by the standards of the age, not extermination, but transplantation. Families were generally kept together, and the deportees were settled, not enslaved. One such deportation of the northern tribes of Israel after the fall of Samaria in 722 before the Common Era echoes to this day in the legend of the 10 lost tribes. And the policy had a consequence no king intended. So many Aramaic-speaking Westerners were moved through the empire that their language, written not in wedges on clay, but in a quick alphabet on parchment, spread everywhere, and slowly, silently, began to replace the ancient tongues of the rivers themselves. The kings who drove this machine were vivid, enormous figures. Ashurnasirpal, who built a new capital at Nimrud, and threw an opening banquet for 69,574 guests. The tablet gives the number precisely, lasting 10 days, listing the thousands of sheep and oxen and the 10,000 skins of wine. Sennacherib, who made Nineveh the greatest city on earth, with parks and orchards watered by an aqueduct of 2 million stone blocks, and whose siege of Jerusalem in 701 stands, recorded twice, once in his own annals, where he boasts of shutting up King Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, and once in the Bible, where an angel of the Lord smites the Assyrian host by night. 2 versions of one event, agreeing on everything except how it ended. Esarhaddon, anxious and brilliant, who conquered Egypt itself, stretching the empire from the Nile to the Persian Gulf, and whose letters to his astrologers reveal a man crushed by omens, asking again and again whether the gods were angry with him. And last of the great line, Ashurbanipal, who could ride and shoot with anyone, and who could also, as he tells us with unconcealed pride, read. "I learned the hidden treasure of the scribal art," he wrote. "I can read tablets from before the flood. This warrior king, who sacked Susa and hunted lions from his chariot, sent his scholars through every temple archive in Babylonia with orders to copy or confiscate everything, tablets of omens, rituals, medicine, mathematics, hymns, epics, and gathered them into his palace at Nineveh. Tens of thousands of tablets, catalogued and shelved, the first systematically collected universal library in human history. He meant it to preserve civilization forever. He could not have guessed how strangely he would succeed. For Assyria's end was already gathering. The empire had grown too vast, its wars too constant, its subjects too bitter, and after Ashurbanipal's death it began to tear along every seam at once. Babylon rose in revolt under a Chaldean general named Nabopolassar and could not be put down. From the eastern mountains came the Medes, a new Iranian power with old grievances. The two joined forces, and in the year 612, before the Common Era, they closed on Nineveh itself. The siege lasted 3 months. Then, the chronicle says, the wall was breached, perhaps helped by the river in flood, and the greatest city in the world went down in a single catastrophe of fire and slaughter. The palaces burned, the carved lions cracked in the heat, and in the burning library, the clay tablets of Ashurbanipal did the one thing clay does in fire. They baked hard as stone, and the collapsing walls buried them safe. The flood story of Gilgamesh among them, to sleep in the dark for 2,500 years. Within a few years, Assyria, which had terrified the world for 3 centuries, had vanished so completely that when Greek soldiers marched past the site of Nineveh 200 years later, they saw only enormous grass-grown mounds, and no one could tell them what the place had been. The prophet Nahum, whose people had suffered much from Assyria, wrote its epitaph while the ashes were still warm. Nineveh is laid waste, he said. Who will mourn for her? And all who hear the news of you clap their hands, for upon whom has your cruelty not fallen? The lion was dead, and every flock in the Near East breathed out at once. Now for one final, dazzling act, the stage belonged again to the oldest player of all, Babylon. Yet the strangest thing about Assyria is what its palaces reveal. When you look past the propaganda, because the same kings who piled heads also piled tablets, endowed temples, built parks stocked with exotic plants and animals from every conquered land, the first botanical and zoological gardens in history, and filled their walls with art of piercing, unwarlike beauty. The lion hunt reliefs of Ashurbanipal, carved for the same king who burned Susa, linger with terrible tenderness on the dying animals. A lioness dragging her paralyzed hindquarters, still roaring, a lion coughing blood with an arrow in his throat. Studies of suffering so exact and so moving that many visitors to the museum where they hang today find themselves grieving for the lions in front of art commissioned by their killer. No one has ever fully explained that contradiction, the cruelty, and the sensitivity flowering from the same court, and perhaps it cannot be explained, only observed, as it must be observed in every empire since. Assyria was not a monster interrupting civilization. It was civilization, armed and frightened and magnificent, and that is a far more uncomfortable thought, and a far more useful one. When Nineveh's palaces rose from the mounds in the 19th century, crowds in London queued to see the winged bulls, and the sculptures that had been carved to terrify ambassadors ended their journey astonishing schoolchildren, which is either history's revenge on Assyria or its final mercy, and perhaps, at this hour of the night, we can let it be both. Hold the lioness and the library together in your mind, the wound and the words, because you cannot understand Assyria, or perhaps any great power before or since, holding only one of them. Nabopolassar, the rebel who broke Assyria, founded a dynasty, but it was his son who made it immortal. Nebuchadnezzar II came to the throne in 605 before the Common Era, fresh from smashing the Egyptian army at Carchemish, and for the next 43 years he ruled the Near East and poured its wealth into one city. Under him, Babylon became what its name still means, in every language, the Great City, the Golden City, the City of Cities. The numbers alone stagger, an outer rampart enclosing an area vast enough to shelter the whole countryside in war. An inner double wall so thick, Greek visitors swore that a chariot and 4 could turn around on top of it. 8 fortified gates, and the greatest of them, the Ishtar Gate, rose in blue-glazed brick, the colour of deep evening sky, its surface alive with golden bulls and striding dragons, moulded in relief, animal after animal, tier upon tier. Through it ran the processional way, a paved avenue lined with 60 lions in glazed brick, snarling white and yellow against that same miraculous blue, down which, every new year, the statues of the gods travelled amid incense and music, while the king took the hands of Marduk. Fragments of that blue still come out of the earth, and the gate itself, rebuilt from its original bricks, stands today in a museum in Berlin, where you can walk past those lions yourself, and thousands of people do, every day, most of them slowing down, without quite knowing why. At the city's heart stood the temple of Marduk, Esagila, the house that raises its head, and beside it the great ziggurat, Etemenanki, the foundation platform of heaven and earth, rebuilt by Nebuchadnezzar in 7 stages. To a height of some 300 feet, its summit temple faced in the same blue glaze, so that it seemed to dissolve into the sky it was climbing toward. To the Judean exiles who now laboured in the city, that arrogant tower reaching for heaven, swarming with the tongues of 100 deported nations, became a story. The Tower of Babel, where the languages of mankind were confounded. For Nebuchadnezzar had continued the old Assyrian policy, and after crushing rebellious Jerusalem, destroying its temple in 587, he had carried its people into captivity by the waters of Babylon, where, their psalm remembers, they sat down and wept when they remembered Zion, and hung their harps upon the willows, and asked how they could sing the Lord's song in a strange land. Out of that grief would come much of the Hebrew Bible in the form we know, which means that Babylon, the wicked city of Scripture, was also, strangely, one of Scripture's cradles, and the Hanging Gardens. Every list of the 7 wonders includes them. Terraces of trees and flowers rising like a green mountain in the middle of the city, watered by hidden engines, built, the story says, by Nebuchadnezzar for his Median queen, Amytis, who was homesick for the mountains of her childhood. It is the most romantic story in Mesopotamian history, and it comes with a mystery worthy of it. For the Babylonian records, which document everything down to single sheep, never mention the gardens at all, and archaeologists have never found them. Perhaps they stood where the river has since washed everything away. Perhaps, as one modern scholar argues in detail, the famous gardens were actually at Nineveh, built by Sennacherib, and the Greek tales confused the 2 cities. Or perhaps a king really did build a mountain of gardens for a homesick queen, and we simply have not found the receipt. Sleep well on whichever version you prefer. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562, and the dynasty wobbled at once. Within a few years the throne passed to Nabonidus, one of the oddest figures ever to rule anywhere, an antiquarian king obsessed with the moon god and with the deep past, who excavated the foundations of ancient temples to find their original inscriptions, kept what has been called the first museum, and then, for 10 inexplicable years, left Babylon altogether to live at a desert oasis in Arabia, while the New Year festival could not be celebrated, and the priests of Marduk nursed a cold fury. His son Belshazzar held the regency at home, the same Belshazzar at whose feast, in the Bible's telling, a disembodied hand wrote on the palace wall the words that meant numbered, weighed, and divided. To the east, Meanwhile, something unprecedented had risen with astonishing speed. A Persian prince named Cyrus had united the Iranian peoples, swallowed the Median Empire, conquered fabulously rich Lydia, and now stood at Babylonia's border with the greatest power in the world at his back and a genius for propaganda in his head. The end, when it came in 539 before the Common Era, was barely a war. One battle on the Tigris, and then, the chronicle says flatly, the army of Cyrus entered Babylon without fighting. Herodotus later told a better story, that the Persians diverted the Euphrates and marched in along the riverbed at night during a festival, while the city danced. However it happened, Babylon was not burned, it was managed. Cyrus arrived weeks later to a stage-managed welcome, green branches spread before him, and issued a proclamation, preserved on a clay cylinder now in the British Museum, in which he announced that Marduk himself, angry at the impieties of Nabonidus, had searched all the lands for a righteous king, had taken Cyrus by the hand, and had called him to Babylon. The conqueror restored the gods to their shrines, sent the deported peoples home, the Judean exiles among them, to rebuild Jerusalem, and behaved, in short, less like a destroyer than like a new landlord, anxious to keep excellent tenants. Nothing seemed to change. The temples ran, the canals flowed, the astronomers watched their stars, but something had changed, finally and forever. For the first time since kingship descended from heaven at Eridu, the land between the rivers, the inventor of the city, the empire, the law, and the written word, was a province in someone else's empire. It would never rule itself again. Life inside Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, the tablets show, was as vivid as its walls. The city held perhaps 200,000 people, the largest concentration of human beings the world had yet seen, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping at hundreds of shrines, buying and selling in markets, where you could hear Egypt and Media and Ionia haggling in the same lane. Great banking families, the Egibai most famous among them, kept archives across generations, lending silver, trading in dates and barley, renting houses, holding shares in canals, a family firm whose books we can audit today across a full century. Astronomers on the temple towers were compiling their nightly diaries. Scribes in the academies were copying texts already older to them than they are to us. And through it all walked the exiles and deportees of a dozen nations, among them the Judeans whose prophets were composing, in Babylon's shadow, visions that would shape 3 world religions, so that the city was, at the same moment, the Bible's image of worldly pride, and the workshop where much of the Bible's own world was forged. Few cities have ever held so much of the future inside their walls without knowing it. Stand once more, before we go on, at the top of the Ishtar Gate, at evening, with the whole shining city below, the river crowded with boats, the ziggurat catching the last light, the smoke of 100,000 suppers rising, and the first lamps coming out like earthbound stars, and understand that no human being had ever seen anything like this, and that everyone who saw it believed, as people always believe at such heights, that it would last forever. Civilizations rarely die in battle. They fade the way a long evening fades, and the fading of Mesopotamia took more than 500 years, so gradual and so gentle, that hardly anyone living through it understood what was being lost. Under the Persians, life between the rivers went on almost unchanged, and Babylonia remained the richest province of the empire, feeding the king of kings from its immortal barley fields. 2 centuries passed this way. Then came Alexander of Macedon, who took Babylon from the Persians in 331, before the Common Era. and who fell under the old city's spell completely. He planned to make it the capital of his world empire, ordered the crumbling ziggurat cleared for rebuilding, and it was there, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, in the summer heat of the year 323, that he lay down with a fever at the age of 32 and did not get up. The last independent glimmers of Babylonian court life flickered around his deathbed. Priests of Marduk consulted, omens read, and a clay astronomical diary in the British Museum records the event in one dry line among the price of barley and the level of the river. The 29th day, it says, the king died. Clouds. After Alexander, his general Seleucus took the east, and the new Greek kings built themselves a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris, a day's ride from Babylon, and invited, and then encouraged, and then more or less compelled Babylon's population to move there. The old city emptied slowly like a tide going out. And yet, in the temples, something remarkable held on, down the Greek centuries and into the Parthian ones. In the precinct of Marduk, families of scholar priests kept the old ways alive, copying the ancient texts, performing the rituals, and, above all, watching the sky. These last Babylonians were, by any fair measure, the best astronomers on earth. Their nightly records of the heavens, kept continuously for some 7 centuries, remain the longest unbroken scientific project in human history. They could predict eclipses, and the positions of the planets with mathematical methods so advanced that when Greek astronomy later dazzled the world, much of its foundation, the degrees, the data, the zodiac itself, was quietly Babylonian. The very last datable cuneiform tablet we possess is an astronomical almanac, written around the year 75 of the Common Era. When Rome ruled the West and the Gospels were being composed, some scholar, one of the final human beings alive who could read the wedges, sat down and recorded the planets for the coming year in the script of Uruk's warehouses, 3,400 years after Kushim signed for his barley. And then the hand stops. The script that had recorded the whole childhood of civilization simply ceased, and within a generation or two, no one on earth could read a single word of it. The cities dissolved back into the mud they were made of. Rivers shifted their beds, canals silted, and the mounds, the tells, as the country people called them, rose silent above the plain, keeping their names sometimes, in worn-down forms and their secrets always. For 17 centuries, Sumer was not even a memory. The world knew of Babylon and Nineveh only what the Bible and the Greeks had said of them. Wicked cities, proud towers, writing on walls. No one knew there had ever been such a thing as a Sumerian. The rediscovery is a story of its own, and it has the shape of a great detective tale. In the 17th century, an Italian traveller named Pietro della Valle sent home from the ruins of Persepolis the first copied lines of a strange, wedge-shaped writing. In the 1830s, a fearless young British officer named Henry Rawlinson dangled on ropes and ladders down a sheer cliff face at Behistun in Persia, where Darius the Great had carved a proclamation in 3 languages and copied it inch by inch, the Rosetta Stone of cuneiform. Through the 1840s and 50s, while Rawlinson and others cracked the script, Austin Henry Layard was digging at Nimrud and Nineveh, sending winged bulls floating down the Tigris on rafts of inflated skins, bound for the British Museum, and with them, in crates, the broken library of Ashurbanipal. Then came George Smith and the flood tablet, and the electric realization that the deciphered wedges held stories older than Genesis. And then, digging ever deeper, scholars found tablets in a language that was not Babylonian at all, older, stranger, and the Sumerians, the inventors of it all, rose back out of the earth after 4,000 years, to take their place at the head of the human story. In the 20th century, Leonard Woolley opened the royal tombs of Ur, and the golden lyres sounded again. The lawstone of Hammurabi came out of Susa. The Ishtar Gate rose again in Berlin, blue as ever, and in one of history's tender ironies, it was the descendants of the region itself, Iraqi archaeologists and scholars, alongside colleagues from every nation, who carried the work forward, so that the land between the rivers is now, again, teaching the world its own oldest lessons. So what, in the end, did Mesopotamia leave us? Almost too much to say. The city and the state. Writing, schools, libraries, literature, the epic, the lament, the proverb, the law code and the contract, the loan and the receipt, the wheel on the road and the sail on the water, the map, the plough, the arch, the dome. 60 minutes, 60 seconds, 360 degrees, the 12 houses of the zodiac, the 7 days named for the 7 wandering stars. Beer and the recipe for it, the flood story and the tower story, the oldest named author, the oldest love songs, the oldest lullabies, and something less tangible and more important. The demonstration, made once and for all on that hot, flat plain, that strangers in their thousands can live together inside a wall, argue their cases before a judge instead of a knife, write down what they owe each other, and build, out of nothing but mud and water and cooperation, a world that outlives them all. Every city on earth tonight, including the one you are falling asleep in, is a descendant of Uruk. The lights outside your window are the grandchildren of temple lamps on a ziggurat. The story you have been listening to is not really the story of a distant, vanished people. It is the first chapter of your own. There is a haunting scene from those last centuries that deserves to be told. Around 250 before the Common Era, with Greek kings ruling and Babylon shrinking around its temple, a priest of Marduk named Berossus sat down and did something no Mesopotamian had ever needed to do. He wrote his civilization's history in Greek. For foreigners, 3 books, from the creation of the world to Alexander, translating the flood, the king lists, the star law, everything, into the conqueror's language, because he could feel, as no one before him ever had reason to feel, that the memory itself was in danger. His books survived only in fragments quoted by later authors, but through them a thin thread of true Mesopotamian memory, the names of Sumer's flood hero, the shape of the old king lists, ran unbroken into the classical world and the Middle Ages, waiting to be reunited in the 19th century. With the tablets rising from the ground, a civilization's last priest, writing its memoir in a foreign tongue so that anything, would survive, and being proven right 2,000 years later. If clay could hope, that is what its hope would look like. The mounds kept their vigil through it all, patient as only earth can be, holding the first civilization safe beneath the grazing sheep until the world was ready to ask its name again. There is one more room in the Mesopotamian house we have not yet entered, and it is the study, because between the rivers, alongside the first cities and laws, human beings began, for the first time, to measure the world. Their mathematics grew, like their writing, out of the storehouse, and it grew strange and powerful. They counted, as we have heard, in 60s, a base with so many divisors that fractions become easy, halves and thirds and quarters and fifths and sixths, all falling out neatly, which is why their system has outlived every empire, and still governs your clock and your compass tonight. Their scribes compiled tables of multiplication, of squares and cubes and reciprocals, and worked problems that we would not hesitate to call algebra, finding unknown sides of fields, unknown weights of stones, solving what a modern student would write as quadratic equations, all in words, all on clay, all 1,000 years and more before Pythagoras was born. And on one small famous tablet in a New York collection, the one scholars call Plimpton 322, a scribe of Hammurabi's era, set out rows of numbers that encode, with perfect accuracy, the relationships between the sides of right triangles, the theorem of Pythagoras, tabulated and mastered 12 centuries before Pythagoras. Why he made the table, whether for surveying, for teaching, or for the pure pleasure of the pattern, is still argued over. And there is something delicious in the fact that the world's oldest mathematical mystery is a homework problem. They measured the earth, dividing fields and calculating the earth to be dug from a canal and the bricks to be moulded for a temple, and they measured the sky. The priests of Babylon watched the heavens at first for omens because the sky was the god's notice board, and a lunar eclipse over the wrong quarter might mean the death of a king, which is why, on certain dreadful nights, a condemned criminal was crowned as a substitute king to absorb the omen, feasted royally for 100 days, and then quietly disposed of, while the true king, who had been pretending to be a farmer, resumed his throne. The record of one such episode, surviving because the real king died anyway, and the substitute, a gardener, reportedly kept the crown, but watching for omens night after night, century after century, the watchers became scientists almost without noticing. They learned the periods of the moon and the 5 wandering stars. They discovered the 18-year rhythm of eclipses that astronomers still call by a Babylonian-derived name, the Saros. By the last centuries of cuneiform, they could compute the positions of the planets years in advance with columns of numbers, pure mathematical astronomy. No myth in it at all, and when the Greeks came to build their science, they built and said so themselves, on Babylonian foundations, on the degrees, the data, the zodiac, and the discipline of the nightly record. Medicine, too, had its tablets, whole libraries of them. If a man's temples hurt and his eyes are dim, the diagnostic series begins and runs on through hundreds of conditions, some recognizable today. Epilepsy described, seizure by seizure, jaundice, tuberculosis, stroke, depression, which they called, with terrible accuracy, the darkening of the heart. Their treatments mixed the useful and the hopeful salves of honey and oil that genuinely fight infection, washes and bandages and splints, herbs by the 100, alongside incantations against the demon of headache, and the ghost behind the ear. And the sensible patient, as we have said, took both, and the honest modern doctor will admit that reassurance is still half the art. They classified everything, for the list was their instrument of thought, lists of stars, stones, plants, animals, gods, professions, words themselves, dictionaries between Sumerian and Akkadian that are the world's oldest grammars, thesauruses, the whole scaffolding of scholarship invented so that a dead language could be kept teachable forever. Which is, if you think about it, the same reason your own dictionaries exist. And they asked the great questions, and did not always comfort themselves with easy answers. One Babylonian poem follows a righteous sufferer, a good man ruined and sick, who cries out that he has done everything the gods require, and cannot understand his agony. The problem of Job, posed on the same plane centuries earlier. Another, the dialogue of pessimism, is a dark comedy in which a master proposes one plan after another, and his servant finds excellent reasons for each. And then, when the master changes his mind, equally excellent reasons against. Until the master finally asks, what, then, is good? And the servant suggests that the only good thing would be for both of them to have their necks broken. And the master, unsettled, says he will have the servant killed first. And the servant replies, calmly, that his master would not outlive him by 3 days. It is the oldest joke about philosophy in the world, and philosophers have not entirely answered it yet. This, too, is Mesopotamia. Not only the mud and the armies, but the lamplit desk, the patient column of numbers, the eye at the rooftop, watching Venus set, the physician's careful notes, the teacher's list, the sufferer's question. The people between the rivers were the first to believe that the world was regular enough to be written down, and, in the long run, that quiet conviction moved more than all their emperors together. And because this is a sleep story, let us end the chapter with their dreams, for of course they studied those too. Dream books survive, long tablets of interpretations. If a man dreams he flies, if he dreams his teeth fall out, if he dreams he eats his own hand, each with its meaning, some ominous, some fortunate, arranged in the same patient list form as the stars and the symptoms. Kings recorded their dreams and consulted specialists. Gudea of Lagash rebuilt a whole temple on the instructions of a dream, and Ashurbanipal's soldiers, frightened at a river crossing, were steadied when the goddess Ishtar appeared by night to a dreamer and promised to walk ahead of the army. There were rituals to wash away a bad dream, telling it to a lump of clay and dissolving the clay in the river, which is, you must admit, a rather beautiful piece of psychology. They lived, in other words, on the same border we all sleep on tonight, between the measured world and the unmeasured one, and they mapped both sides with the same reed pen. And they would be pleased, and not at all daffodils, and not at all surprised to know that a voice is still telling their story to people drifting across that border right now. And when you next glance at a clock, notice what you are actually looking at. A circle divided into 60, read twice over, minutes and seconds, exactly as the scribes of Babylon divided it, so that there is a small, precise sense in which every hour of your life, including this one, now dissolving so pleasantly towards sleep, has been measured out for you by the mathematicians of Mesopotamia, who would be deeply satisfied to know it, and would probably send an invoice. Their reach is everywhere once you look. The 7-day week keeping tonight in its place. The zodiac in the morning paper. The very habit of writing the date at the top of a page. All of it flows from that lamplit desk between the rivers, where someone first decided that time itself could be caught in a net of numbers, and quietly, patiently, over 3,000 years, turned out to be right. Of all their monuments, the invisible ones, the minute, the degree, the diagnosis, the dictionary, have proven the most indestructible and the least thanked, which is the usual fate of infrastructure and of scholars. Before we let the story rest, let us walk back into that world one last time, not through its kings and centuries now, but through a single turning of the year, because the people of the rivers did not live in history. They lived in seasons, the same wheel turning over every life in this story, from the reed hut of the first farmer to the blue gate of Nebuchadnezzar. Begin in autumn, when the terrible heat finally breaks. The date harvest is in, the presses sticky and humming with wasps, and the ploughing begins in the softened fields. Ploughing is the great communal labour of the year, teams of oxen dragging the cedar plough, a Mesopotamian invention with a funnel that drops the seed grain directly into the furrow, and the farming manuals, for they wrote farming manuals, instruct the ploughman in everything. The depth of the furrow, the spacing of the seed, the words to say to the goddess of the grain. We possess an entire text, cast as a father's advice to his son, that follows the farmer's year task by task, and it ends, after all its practical wisdom about dikes and oxen and weeding, with the reminder that the harvest belongs, first, to heaven, Winter is the green season, mild and busy, the barley rising, the canals needing their endless maintenance, gangs of men waist-deep in cold mud, dredging, patching, cursing, paid in bread and beer and onions. The nights can turn sharply cold on the open plain, and families crowd close to the brazier. And this is the season of stories, when the fables and the epics earn their keep in the long dark. Then spring, the beautiful and dangerous season. The barley turns gold in March and April, and the whole country pours into the fields for harvest, cutting, binding, carting, threshing under the hooves of oxen, winnowing in the evening wind, the chaff, blowing like warm snow. And even as the sickles swing, everyone is watching the rivers, because far away in the mountains the snow is melting, and the flood is coming, and the whole year balances on whether it comes late and gentle or early and wrathful. When it comes gently, the water spreads shining across the fallow land, the frogs sing all night, and the storehouses fill. And there is no happier country on earth. When it comes in wrath, the dikes stand or the world ends, and every man in the district stands on the embankment in the dark with a torch and a spade, fighting the oldest enemy. It is no accident that when this civilization imagined the end of all things, it imagined water. And then summer, the ordeal, the sun like a hammer, the earth splitting, the rivers shrinking into their beds. Work moves to dawn and dusk. Nobles retreat to shaded courtyards, the poor endure, everyone sleeps on the roofs, and the myths say the god of fertility himself has died and gone down into the underworld, and the women sing the old laments for him at the door of the sheepfold, songs for dead Dumuzi, songs the prophet Ezekiel could still hear women singing at the north gate of Jerusalem's temple 2,000 years later. And around the wheel of work turned the wheel of feasts. Every month had its festival, every city its own calendar of the sacred, days when the workshops closed and the god came out of the temple to visit the fields, or sail the canal in a ceremonial barge, days of roast meat for people who rarely ate it, of beer in the streets, of music and wrestling, and, the texts make clear, a certain amount of respectable mischief after dark. Above all, at the spring equinox, the new year, the Akitu, 11 days when the whole cosmos was serviced like a great canal, the creation epic recited, the king humbled and reinstated, the destinies of the coming year fixed by the assembled gods, and the whole population feasting on the temple's abundance. A person born between the rivers would see the wheel turn 70 times if they were lucky, ploughing, greening, harvest, flood, furnace, festival, and around again. And every turning wore the fear a little smoother, and the gratitude a little deeper. When they wished each other well, their letters always used the same phrase, "May my God keep you in good health. May your heart be at ease." The kings and the empires of our story rose and fell across 3,000 years, but this, the wheel of the seasons and the wish at the bottom of every letter, never changed at all. It has not really changed yet. Even the sounds of that year have partly survived. We know the creak of the shadoof, the counterweighted pole that lifted water from canal to field, because it is still creaking in villages along these rivers tonight, unchanged in 5,000 years. We know the songs were work songs, because the texts mention the chant of the oxen drivers and the answering call of the harvesters, and we know the ox drivers sang to their oxen by name, because the names are recorded, and they are the names farmers have always given. Strong One, White Star, Stubborn. We know the smell of the year, wet clay and cut barley and date syrup boiling, dung fires and river mist, and the green breath of the marshes. And we know its tastes, because recipes survive, actual recipes, on 3 battered tablets in a New York collection, stews of lamb with garlic and onion and beer, a spiced pigeon dish, instructions confident enough to cook from, and modern chefs have cooked from them and report that the oldest cuisine on record is in fact delicious. History mostly hands us the words of kings. Here for once, it hands us dinner and dinner. At the end of a long day between the rivers is history too. There is a tablet, one of thousands like it, on which a scribe recorded the year's flood heights, day by day, the river rising, cresting, falling in neat columns of numbers, and somewhere behind those wedges you can feel the whole village on the embankment. The held breath, the water stopping, one hand's width, below the top of the dike, and the long exhale of a country allowed to keep its year. That exhale is the true sound of Mesopotamian history, 3,000 years of it, and it is a good sound to borrow now at the end of a long day of your own. The dike's held, the grain is in, breathe out with them. The farming manual with which we began this chapter ends with a blessing over the field, and the field, in a sense, has passed the blessing on. Because the wheat and barley in every loaf on earth tonight are the direct descendants of grain, first tamed in those hills, and first watered on that plain, an unbroken green thread, running from the earliest arrow furrow to your own kitchen. Empires are mortal. Breakfast, it turns out, is not. And if you wanted a single image to hold all of Mesopotamia as you drift, you could do worse than a field of young barley in the winter sun, ankle deep and impossibly green against the brown plain, with the canal shining beside it, and the ziggurat small and patient on the horizon, the whole of civilization present in one quiet acre, growing. Somewhere along those rivers tonight, this very night, the wheel is still turning, the dates are ripening, or the barley is greening, or the water is rising, and the oldest year on earth is going quietly about its business, exactly as it did before anyone was there to write it down, and exactly as it will after. And one more visit, the quietest of all, set aside the kings entirely now, and listen to the voices, because the miracle of this civilization is that we can. The clay kept everything. And among the hundreds of thousands of tablets are the small papers of ordinary lives. And reading them is like pressing an ear to a wall behind which people have been talking for 4,000 years. Listen to Nanny, a customer in the city of dictating the world's oldest known complaint letter to a copper merchant named Nasir. "You promised me fine copper ingots," he fumes. "You put ingots before my messenger that were not good, and you said, 'Take them or leave them.' Who am I that you should treat me with such contempt?" He goes on for both sides of the tablet, demanding his money back, itemizing every insult. And here is the detail historians treasure. This tablet was found in the ruins of Nasir's own house, along with other complaints about him from other customers. The worst copper merchant in kept his bad reviews, and whether out of shamelessness or a strange pride, he stored them carefully, and the desert preserved them, so that his name is now, forever, the most famous name in the history of customer service. Listen to the boy Sin, away at school, writing to his mother Zenu. "From year to year," he says, "the clothes of the young gentlemen here get better, but you let my clothes get worse. The son of a man whose father is only my father's assistant has 2 new sets of clothes, while you fuss even about a single set for me. You do not love me." Every parent listening tonight has received this letter. Listen to the anxious father, in a long composition the schools copied for centuries, pleading with a son who will not study. "I never sent you to work the plough," he says. "I never made you carry reeds. Other boys support their parents with their labour. And all I ask is that you go to school, and you wander the public square instead." And listen to the son's silence, which is also faithfully preserved. Listen to the physicians and the worried. A court doctor writes to the king of Assyria about a sick child in the palace. The fever has broken, he reports. The boy is much better. Let the king my lord be glad. A woman writes to a distant husband that their small son has begun to walk. A merchant's wife, left to run everything at home, ends a brisk, businesslike letter with a sudden crack in the plaster. Why do you never write to me? Are you well? I am anxious. Listen to the Proverbs, where the whole population speaks at once. A loving heart builds the house, they said, and a hateful heart destroys it. Tell a lie, and then tell the truth, and it will be counted a lie. The poor man is better dead than alive, they said too, for if he has bread, he has no salt, and if he has salt, he has no bread. They were not sentimental people, and yet listen to the lullabies, for even those survive. A royal nurse in singing "Sleep, sleep, come to my son," over a restless royal baby, promising him, if he closes his eyes, a happy wife and a fine harvest and joy at his side. Listen, last of all, to a scribe named Sinleki Unini, or whoever it truly was, closing the great epic, telling us that Gilgamesh came back from the edge of the world, exhausted and empty-handed, and found peace, and engraved the whole story on a stone. All of them are gone, the complainer and the copper cheat, the homesick schoolboy and his tired mother, the doctor and the baby, the nurse and the king's son who finally fell asleep. The rivers themselves have wandered from the cities they built, but the words are still here, and tonight they have been spoken again, into the darkness of rooms they could never have imagined, on the far side of the world, and the distance between us and them, which seemed at the start of this story to be the widest gulf in history, has turned out to be no distance at all. It is the same species, the same worries, the same courage, the same wish at the bottom of every letter. May your heart be at ease. One more voice, and then we will let them rest. On a tablet now in a museum drawer, a scribe finishing a long copy added, as scribes often did, a colophon, a little note at the end, his name, his father's name, the date, and sometimes a plea. Let the wise not deceive the ignorant, one writes. Another blesses whoever reads the tablet and curses whoever steals it, in terms of splendid ferocity. And more than one closes with a single word of pure, weary, human triumph that needs no translation across the millennia. Finished, somewhere in Nineveh, or Babylon, or A man set down his stylus in the lamplight, flexed his cramped fingers, looked at the wet clay-filled edge to edge with his good, careful signs, and wrote, "Finished," and went home to his supper and his family and his sleep, never imagining that his little sigh of completion would outlast the city, the empire, the language, and the gods, and would be read aloud, one night, on the other side of the world, to people falling asleep who understood exactly how he felt. And perhaps that is the right note on which to leave the tablets, not the king's boasts, and not the laments, but the small signatures of completion and care scattered through the clay, the teacher's corrections on a student's exercise, still visible, the tiny fingerprints, found more than once, of children who touched tablets while they were wet 4,000 years ago, and were probably shooed away, and are now, by that one forbidden touch, the most immortal children in history. The clay kept everything, the great and the small alike, without judging which was which. And it turns out, after all the empires have been weighed, that the small things are the ones that reach us. A fingerprint, a complaint about copper, a mother's worry, a word meaning finished. That is what 5,000 years actually leaves behind, and it is more than enough, and it is waiting to receive our own small things too, whatever form our clay may take. It is customary, at the end of a history, to draw a lesson. But the tablets have already drawn it in a proverb their schoolboys copied until they knew it by heart. Whatever has been built falls, the proverb runs, and whatever has been planted grows again. The cities fell. The plantings, the wheat, the words, the laws, the numbers, the stories, grew again in other soils, under other names, and are growing still, in the very language of this sentence. That is the whole shape of these 5,000 years, and it fits. You may notice in the palm of a hand, on a piece of clay about the size of the one Cushim signed, all those barley harvests ago, when the world was new. Whoever you are, wherever this night finds you, you are now part of the long chain of listeners, stretching back through the courtyards, and the rooftops, and the reed houses, to the first fire where the first story was told, and the chain does not break, because someone at the end of it falls asleep. That has always been how the story is passed along. And here at last our story settles into stillness. 5,000 years have passed through this night. The reed huts and the ziggurats, the schoolboys and the kings, the golden lyres of and the blue lions of Babylon, and now they all grow quiet together, the way the plain grows quiet when the sun has gone and the herons have settled in the reeds. The rivers are still flowing, somewhere out there in the dark, as they were flowing before the first city, and will flow long after the last. Everything that seemed so urgent, the harvests, the wars, the empires, has folded itself into the silence, and the silence is not empty. It is full the way deep water is full. Let the names drift now. Let Uruk and Sargon and Hammurabi, Gilgamesh and his friend, sink softly down like silt, settling in still water, layer upon gentle layer, 5,000 years deep. You do not need to hold on to any of it. The clay remembers, so that you can forget. Rest now, as the first farmers rested when the dikes were sound and the grain was in. Let your breathing find the slow rhythm of the rivers. The night is old and kind, and it has watched over every sleeper in this story. Now it watches over you. Sleep well, and good night.